Hello, everybody. This is the Falsifiable Podcast. I am your host, Eric Denton, and today we have a very special guest. It is Professor David Deutsch. He is the author of two books, one being The Fabric of Reality and the other being The Beginning of Infinity. Anybody that's listening to this podcast currently already knows this, I'm sure. Both of these books are very inspirational and they're quite different than any popular science books I've read that I can actually think of that are for the general public. And I'm going to ask a couple of questions about these books. But before I do that, are there any shows or movies or books currently inspiring your work right now? And the reason I'm asking this is creativity tends to be inspired by other creativity. Is there something that you're watching that is sort of juicing you as we speak?
Not right now. I mean, I have said before that there are certain pinnacles of cinematographic excellence or televisual excellence that have inspired me in the past, though not specifically. It's more that I've been encouraged that there are people out there who like see things the right way. So one of them is House or House MD, as you call it.
Mm,
And that's fairly obvious why I like that because it's basically about epistemology. It's about uh, how scientific knowledge is created and how that's often, well, it's always fallible and how it's often counterintuitive. And they get it right on that show again and again. I don't especially like all the series of it, all the seasons of it, but where it talked about epistemology, I agreed with it.
mm.
And another one that I particularly liked, which had the same problem that not every season was actually good, but the ones that were good were superb, and that's Buffy.
Yeah.
And that's for a different reason. But Buffy investigates all the nuances of having a universe in which morality is not the same as it is in our universe. I
Mm.
don't mean the quantum universes. I mean an entire setup of laws of physics and people and different kinds of people and laws of morality and reasoning about this that is different from ours. And they immediately encounter and address the various problems that arise. For example, if it really makes a moral difference whether someone has a soul or not, or just looks as though they have a soul, they move around and walk and talk and so on, but they don't have a soul. Is it conceivable that that makes a moral difference to how you should treat them?
Mm.
And this has come up. It's called the zombie problem by philosophers. And there's more than one take one can have that seems to make sense, and some of them seem to make sense but don't make sense. And so I was a Buffy fan.
Wow, that's it's interesting how both of those shows are so popular. And for some reason, whenever I think of you, David, I would think like, oh, David's gonna have this obscure like show that he watches. And these are really popular shows, but you pinpointed something in them that most people don't, which is in the one house being epistemology and the other Buffy being this landscape of morality that's
Yes,
different in other,
exactly.
so that's super fascinating. Does that sort of stuff inspire whenever you're writing a book, though, does it inspire how you, or fiction in general, inspire how you write your books?
Well, again, I don't think inspire is the right word. What that sort of thing does is it gives me a view of the lie of the land, like what people are thinking about this kind of thing, what people find interesting, what they don't find interesting that I think should be interesting, and that sort of thing. I also watch bad documentaries for the same reason.
Mm.
So I find them both entertaining and revealing in that they show me what kinds of bad argument are swallowed by many people and why. I can guess in each case why I may be wrong, but so that's another thing to think about. I certainly don't think that's an example of being inspired,
Is
but
it when you say bad documentary, do you mean something like Fahrenheit 9/11 or something by like Michael Moore? Is that what you mean? Or as
well,
far as
I haven't seen that. No, I mean documentary series
oh, okay.
on things like the Discovery Channel or whatever,
Mm,
uh, really badly misnamed by now. Um, so things like uh, moon landing conspiracies and supernatural and flying saucers and that kind of thing. I don't really watch it for the content.
mm,
It's more for the way that they put together arguments. Um, and um, they're obviously catering to a market, a fan base or whatever you call it. And again, that gives me an idea of um, how can I put this? Because presumably that's not my audience,
mm,
but it does. It's not the people. It's the arguments. It's the way that the arguments work, the
mm.
way that bad arguments work that interests me quite a lot.
What's can you, this is kind of hard to do off the top of your head, but what's an example of that, would you say?
Oh, yeah, it is hard to do off the top of your head. Let me see. Uh, well, something like so they want to say a documentary wants to say that something or other is supernatural or reveals the presence of aliens or past civilizations or that kind of thing. So they say a typical sort of pattern of argument is um, scientists assume that so and so is true. Now that's already technically speaking that's a lie. But where you can say, well, all scientific theories are conjectures, so in that sense they are assumptions. Okay, so I'll let that one go. And then they say, but here is something, a strange piece of evidence. Could it be that this was left by the aliens or whatever? Could it be? No, that's just asking questions. A typical sign of a conspiracy theory.
Right.
We're just asking questions.
Mm,
Um, and then later, a minute later or 5 minutes later in the same documentary, they are assuming that as a fact.
mm,
So, and they're assuming it as evidence of further things they want to allege.
mm-hmm. Right.
And I can see how that works as an argument because in real life, in rational life, no argument is watertight. They all depend on a friendly going along with the argument, suspending belief, as Popper says. He says it's never rational to believe something,
Mm,
but it's often rational to suspend belief.
mm.
So you suspend belief in whatever you thought, and you let them make their best case. And this can be subverted. This can be misused.
Mm,
And I think most people are presented with many bad arguments during their education, and so they have a very low bar for criticizing arguments. And so when another thing, another trope that I see a lot is that they look as though how can I say this succinctly? They look as though they are a teacher in a science class,
Mm-hmm.
and they often have a whiteboard or animations or some examples, and they say just as I don't know, every creature in the forest runs away from a forest fire, so humans run away from ideas which challenge their beliefs.
Mm.
And so you're thinking, oh, I don't want to be that kind of human. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so the the very openness of people's thinking can be turned against them, and this can make people cynical about all arguments and so on. So you see, there's I don't claim to be an expert on this kind of stuff, by the way.
Mhm.
I mostly watch it for, as I say, grounding myself in the lie of the land.
Right. Yeah, it shows like ancient aliens and stuff. And then they have a scientist that'll say something. And then, as you say, they'll stick them in front of a whiteboard with equations on the back. And
Yeah,
the average person will look at that and say, well, this is an authority of science right here. And they think of science
yes,
as an authority. And then they say things like science tells us and use science as like
that
this.
sort of thing. And
Uh,
the root of that scam
mm,
is that this is exactly what teachers in school and university do. They
mm,
set themselves up as authorities rather than, as I and Popper would have it, what they should be doing is saying, here is a problem, and here are some conjectures that people have made. Now, come at me. What's wrong with my conjecture? That's what a science lesson should be, but it never
right.
is.
There are people that come off as knowing more than they know to the public when they're iconoclastic, I feel like. It's when they're negative about things, which as uh, if you study Popper, the whole idea is criticizing theories. But again, what you've added to that in your books, and I'm going to go to a quote of yours in a moment. You've added this idea of it's all about explanatory power. So whenever you present an idea, it's not just asking questions. You're asking a question based on a theory that you formed, which is because it's a good explanation that you have in your head, which is an explanation that's
Yes,
hard to vary. So then you can test from there. You don't just ask
yes,
arbitrary questions.
yes,
And as you said a
yes,
moment ago with like on these shows, they'll say something like an alien could have sat this here. I'm like,
yes,
and you would say, well, anybody could have sat it there, but
yes,
that's not the question. you know?
yes.
Um, so that leads me to this right here. This comes from The Fabric of Reality, which is interesting because a lot of people cite your book, The Beginning of Infinity, far more than The Fabric of Reality, as far as I can tell in the public. And that book, Your Beginning of Infinity, I think just keeps selling more copies as time goes on rather than less. It's an interesting and it's great phenomenon. Um,
They
but you have
both
a
do. Yeah.
yeah, well, that's and I preach these books to people. I tell them,
Oh, thank you.
not as an authority, but I try to tell them, listen, read this, it will open you up. But you have a quote in here, first, or it's in the Roman numeral pages on the preface. It says, "Our best theories are not only truer than common sense, they make far more sense than common sense does." For a person that doesn't know anything about you, that is a hard statement to unpack. What do you mean by that?
Well, so what I meant by that is please read the rest of the book and you'll see what I mean.
Right.
But but the thing is that common sense, the take on things that we have without necessarily having investigated it or without forming a scientific theory or the theories that take the takes on things that used to be natural before the advent of science, before the scientific revolution, um, people people look up at the sky and they saw that the sky was blue in the daytime and black at nighttime, but at nighttime it also had these shining spots, and so what are they? Well, nobody before quite recent times guessed what they are, not even close.
Mm,
They're like I say in that book, they are spheres of gas 1 million kilometers in diameter, powered by nuclear fusion,
mm,
which again was not known about until the 20th century. So nobody came close, so that they had common sense ideas. Well, what could it be? Oh, and they all rotate round in synchrony. They all go rigidly rotating, uh, keeping the same angles and distances towards each other, except a few, the planets.
mm.
Planets means wanderers. So even in ancient Greek times, it was known that the common sense theory can't be true, because it what the common sense theory was is that the sky was a sphere surrounding the Earth, and the stars were lights on that sphere, or else holes in the sphere through which light from the outside, from heaven or something, was shining. And that is simply refuted by planets.
Mm.
And um, even though it's refuted by planets, it's so common sense that people continue to believe it until like the Middle Ages.
Mm.
So uh, so that's why common sense doesn't make sense if you look at it closely enough. But our best theories make much more sense than that, because our best theories do not have that kind of mismatch or gap or hole for inconsistency in them. They have had all those inconsistencies um, repaired, and the theory altered again and again and again, so that it makes sense. And now it's almost impossible to look at the sky and find something that uh, uh, even an amateur interested in astronomy could not explain.
Mm. Yeah.
With powerful telescopes, we can see things that nobody can explain. But even now, but still, it is far superior
Mm.
than the common sense explanation. And people who aren't interested in questions like what are the stars really, they still have those same misconceptions even to this day. That's no criticism of them. Nobody has to be interested in everything. And if it as long as they don't try to force this common sense theory onto other people, it's fine. They are doing what people ought to be doing. They ought to be trying to find good explanations of things that do interest them.
Right. In this book, or I think it might be in the beginning of Infinity, you talk about when right now you're talking about understanding things in a way that's much deeper than just knowing facts. You're talking about how things work. And for the longest time, what you're describing is induction. You look at the sky and then you think there's like this complicated series of events that are happening, but where these things go in a circular pattern, everything else behind that's going in this pattern, and you write it out on a thing and like just say that's the facts. This is how it is, and this explains everything. Where in
Yes,
fact that again doesn't make sense if you encapsulate everything like seasons and stuff. You have to have, there has to be something further, but we don't see this thing. It has to
yes,
be created in our minds. And this is what you've pointed out in your books and what led me to reading Popper. And I think a lot of people have this experience with you, is that this idea of creating something in your brain and foisting it onto and applying that to the world. It's never perfect, but this is how we know things and understand things.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And when you were reading Bertrand Russell back in your day and you came to where it just, as you say on another podcast I heard you say you get to Bertrand Russell, you read like the history of Western philosophy, and then you get to induction, the problem of induction, full stop. That's where it ends right there. And then Popper continues this. What was your experience whenever you got to Popper? Like how, when you're reading his book, which at the time was the political philosophy that he put forth in Open Society. What
Yeah.
about it struck you? I mean, did it take a long time for this to hit you, or what
Yes, it
was it?
did.
Yeah.
No, it hit me as being good
Mm.
immediately. I mean, I only had to read a few pages, and I saw the difference in quality, sheer quality of argument, even from Russell. And
Mm.
Russell was pretty good compared with other philosophers. So, but you said it ended with induction. My experience was. And when I look back on it, I realized that, there's something serious going on here. My experience was that I saw nothing wrong with the theory of induction. I
Mm.
read Russell explaining it and how, and I even read his critique of it. It's a feature of the theory of induction and of the problem of induction that induction has been, in a certain sense, has been known to be false from the time that it was first proposed in ancient Greece. But instead of saying this is the reason why it can't be right, let's look for a better theory of how knowledge is created, it was elevated into the problem of induction.
Mm.
And philosophers ever since have, and even to this day, have just think of themselves as addressing the problem of induction, and they write a new thing about this great problem. And no, it's sort of almost taboo among that school of philosophers to claim to have solved it. And Popper begins one of his books or one of his articles, I forget, with the words, "I think I have solved a major philosophical problem, the problem of induction." And um, and this 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 causes him to be despised in certain circles
Mm.
because it's their sacred problem. How dare you solve it? Anyway, he did solve it, and as in those days, it was hard to get books, Popper books. I could have ordered books, but I didn't know which ones to order, and it's not like today where you can browse them on Amazon.
Mm.
So the first one I bought was one of his political philosophy books, which didn't inherently interest me at the time. But already, as I said, already I could see there the huge increase in clarity and philosophical quality in his writing. So it got me sort of interested, and then I understood his theory of knowledge, and then I got some of his other books. There was a period when whenever I went somewhere to a city or wherever, I would find a bookshop and see if I could find any Popper books, and
Mm.
sometimes I did, and then I bought them, and that was sort of a how I got to read more and more Popper randomly. But it took approximately 4 years from the moment when I realized, or when I realized that Popper was good, or from the moment when I began to call myself a Popperian,
Mm.
to the moment when I actually got it, took about 4 years.
Mm. Yeah.
Because it is counterintuitive. It maybe less so now because other people have taken up trying to explain Popper, and it's not that, as I keep saying, it's not that Popper is obscure in his writing. It's just that the ideas themselves are so different from um, what um, the prevailing philosophy of knowledge is.
Hmm. Just to contrast this, to frame this really quickly. So there was induction. This is even though it wasn't true, and people knew that it wasn't true all the way from like the ancient Greeks till now. And they even talk about this. David Hume lays it out perfectly,
Yeah,
where
yeah,
he's like, this simply isn't true, and yet
yeah.
I'm going to behave as if it is.
Yes,
And induction, for anybody who's doesn't know of this, it's like where you you take a particular instance and then you form a theory off of that, a general theory off of a particular instance. What Popper did is he reversed that. He puts the cart before the horse. And again, common sense tells you to not put the cart before the horse. But Popper says, no, let's hypothesize first and then test rather than, so basically have the theory and then use your senses to test that theory,
Yes,
essentially.
although before you have a theory, you have to have a problem. So
Mm.
stage one in the
Right.
scheme is you have a problem. You want to know something. You're dissatisfied with what you already know. You think there's something missing. You think there's something that must be wrong.
Mm.
You and so on, something like that. So that some problem. Then you form a conjecture. So the problem is first, that doesn't require observation. I mean, it might come from observation, but typically not.
Mm.
Um, and it doesn't come from observation in the sense that you want to generalize that observation.
Right.
Very often that can't be. How is it that it looks as though it's true, but it isn't true? Like when you're watching a conjuring trick, what that's all about is you see something happening and you know it can't be true. And what you're conjecturing is what could really be happening to make it look as though that thing is true, make it look as though the cup was under one, the ball was under one cup, it's actually under a different one, or actually under none of them, or actually there are five balls under the cup, and so on. And only then does it come to testing the theory. Once you have the original theory and a rival theory, or original conjecture and a rival conjecture, then you can sometimes test them, or at
Mm.
least you can always criticize them. You can criticize your new theory and the old one and see which one solves the problem better.
Right. And some people would accuse Popper of his theory not being falsifiable, which this is a confusion that's really, I mean, it actually, it's obvious what the problem is with this statement, but
Yes,
because he's saying something metaphysical, he's not against metaphysics. He's not a logical positivist. And
exactly.
what he was putting forth was what he called, I think, a metaphysical research program, which is similar to Darwin's theory, which is it's an encapsulating, it's a framework of how to work. Uh, could you elaborate on that at all, David?
Yes, well, as you rightly say, this scheme of Popper's about testing theories and so on, that applies to science,
Mm.
which is where the theories are about the physical world. And we're trying to form general theories about the physical world. Now, if you have a theory that's about something else, say mathematics or morality, and then there are, evolution is a case of that because at least in Darwin's time, we couldn't actually observe evolution.
Right. Yeah.
The evolution, if it happened, happened too long ago to have left any records. So what we have to do is we can't proceed with experiment. So we have to, but luckily the problem isn't that. The problem is with the problem Darwin was solving was how can this be? How can something so perfectly adapted to performing a certain task have got that way without being designed for it?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the problem he solved. And so this is not the same as trying to solve the problem of why do elephants exist, or not quite why. It's why specifically elephants?
Mm-hmm.
Why not an animal with six legs instead of four, and so on? So that's a different question. That's a question about the history of biology, not the metaphysics of biology, the philosophy of biology, and that's really what Darwin solved. Although it's a philosophical problem that does have its roots in observation.
Mm.
But again, it's not that we're trying to say. if you started out with an ancestor of the elephant and put it on the same kind of environment, would it turn into an elephant? Would it evolve into an elephant after a few million years? That's not the question. And even if it did, the problem that Darwin solved would still be there. The problem
Right.
would still be, how can that be?
Mm.
How can that happen without design? And so now other problems, also philosophical problems. So Popper's accused of not being scientific. Well, again, same thing. Even if you had a theory of the brain that could predict whether a given brain is going to be like an Einstein or Darwin, that wouldn't begin to solve the problem of whether it works by induction or not.
Mm.
Or if not, what does it work by? That's a different question. And it's a more interesting question in both the epistemology case and in the Darwin case.
Let's say you have somebody like Paul Simon or Mozart. It is fascinating that why this person, why is it that because creativity, I equate regular creativity, artistic creativity with scientific creativity. And why is it that
Yes.
somebody like Einstein, what was it about him? And we've done stuff like this where we've studied his brain. What did we find from that? Absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
And but it is curious though, and I guess, and I'm the reason I mention it just as a sheer, maybe I'm trying to form a theory tacitly that I don't know of, but I it does. I see what you're pushing against. See if this is what you're pushing against. You're pushing against this idea that basically an authority, it sort of falls in the camp of authority in a way because it's like a person that nobody else can attain this
Yeah, yeah,
ability. Yeah,
exactly. That
exactly.
that
Yeah.
that is one of the things, one of the inevitable consequences of this way of thinking
Hmm.
that poisons young people's minds. Because
Right.
who is going to actually think, I'm like him?
Hmm.
No, as soon as you say you've got to be like him, you're setting up an impossible goal in the wrong direction.
Mm.
So it's A, it's impossible, and B, it's in the wrong direction.
You know what? I'm working on a book right now myself about Popper and Darwin, and one of the things actually is this, where I'm talking about how biographies don't matter. But in order to do that, I have to talk about their biography. And it's like I have to say, listen, the one thing interesting about Darwin, actually, well, not as much Popper. Popper was precocious as all get out, but Darwin was pretty ordinary almost in every facet, except he had this one idea that extended to every realm almost,
Yeah.
and it is very curious that he had this idea, but it was a very bold conjecture, and where you actually can make predictions and all with this, and to this day it hasn't been refuted, so it remains Darwinian evolution remains the best theory on offer,
Well,
and
it's neo-Darwinism now,
neo-Darwinism, yeah. And
but that just is Darwinism plus genetics.
right.
You mentioned Mozart, by the way. So Mozart, well, I think I understand from a Mozart expert I spoke to that the stereotype of Mozart writing everything down in a pristine way without ever changing anything, that's just false.
Mm,
He did make lots of mistakes and crossed out and tried different ideas, but nowhere near as much as Beethoven, for example, who
mm,
threw away draft after draft after draft before he hit on what he wanted. And so there's Mozart, who's relatively laid back about the composition process. Beethoven, who agonizes over everything, and Brahms is different again. He would get up early every morning, sit down with one cup of coffee after another, and just compose and compose and compose and compose, and then stop.
mm.
It was like being on an assembly line for him.
Right. Oh, you've just opened this up for me as we're speaking. It is the fact that these guys, all of the guys we're talking about right now, whether it's Darwin, Mozart, or whoever, it's that they landed on a problem, which was a gift
Yes,
that kept
yes,
giving. And that
yes,
was their whole thing. They had a problem. What is this composition? I can't figure it out. It's never going to be perfect because
yes.
compositions just come from your head. And you could take notes, add notes, and whatever is the Beethoven's fifth. It is what it is today. He could have added another note though that we just don't know about, but for some reason it landed where it's at. It's not perfect, but it's pretty darn awesome. But it's because they landed on a problem, is what I think it is.
That's exactly right.
Right.
And I think in the case of those three composers that we mentioned, they no doubt each of their works can be improved without limit, but they stopped when they couldn't think of a way of making it any better.
Hmm.
So long as they could keep thinking of ways of making it better, they didn't stop. And their personalities had to adapt to that necessity. The epistemology is always the same. It's always Popperian.
Right.
But how a particular person who is driven to solve some problem, how they make that work in their own life, depends on what kind of person they are, but not on the problem or its solution. That that, their life doesn't come into that. The Brahms's coffee doesn't come into judging his music.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. It's their problem situation that they've come upon, which is so it's like the idea that whoever invented, which I don't know this off the top of my head, but whoever invented numbers, uh, they never realized that with those numbers they were going to
Yeah,
create endless problems.
yeah,
And now we have all these problems with numbers. They never knew that these whatever it is, 10 numbers, 0 through 9, would have given us so much to work with, essentially.
yeah.
So
Well,
yeah.
the number system was invented by the Babylonians,
Mm.
and they did have they were interested in abstract problems with numbers. I mean, nothing compared with today, but they knew Pythagoras' theorem and they knew about prime numbers and they knew about solving equations and that kind of thing. So they we don't know who these people were.
Mm.
They didn't name their discoveries in those days.
And now here we are today. You got interested in science for whatever reason. Actually, you kind of do land on it in the beginning of Infinity, where you were literally asking yourself, can how people back in the past were so lucky they could understand everything. Like, Socrates or whoever became before him could understand everything because there was not as much to understand. And now, then you, I think, realize, like, wait a minute, actually, that would suck to understand
Yeah.
everything. It's better to have an endless, uh, it's better for everything to be open, which in fact is the case.
Yes.
That learning is, we're never going to land on the truth, and if we did land on the truth, we wouldn't know that we were on the truth. Is the
Yes.
whole thing, for sure.
Yes.
Do you think that this kind of brings so that was I say all that just to put a fine point on your biography. Um, do you find just a transition here, speaking of conspiratorial thinking and bad explanations, as a user of X or Twitter, I don't use it anymore. I just couldn't stomach it as much because of all the bad explanations that were going on. Is How much of a problem is this nowadays? Do you see it rising or falling, or is this a illegitimate question? What do you think?
Um, no, it's a legitimate question. It's a very interesting question, which and a set of problems that I think need to be solved.
Mm,
Um, I think Twitter has had similar problems ever since it was founded. There's an inherent tension between the need to moderate it's just the tension between toleration and intolerance. You know, Popper says that we have to take the right to be intolerant of intolerance.
Mm,
And on a discussion forum, it's perfectly possible for a small proportion of people to completely sabotage every discussion. Because if you wake up in the morning and see, you know, your feed on the discussion, and you've got 90 abusive um, replies and three polite ones, well, what do you do? Well, I have found that block is your friend.
right. Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
that does go along with Popper's yeah, not being tolerant of intolerance. Yeah.
yes,
Mm,
but it the problem is not solved,
right.
and um, I I I was already um, when October 7th, the pogrom happened. I had been reducing my Twitter presence, my X presence, whatever you call it now,
Hmm.
simply because it it um, it took up more time and intellectual energy than the pleasure of engaging was worth. It's not that it wasn't pleasurable to have engage with random people around the world about random ideas. I think it's wonderful that we can do that now, and I certainly wouldn't want any more to live in the world in which one can't do that. But I was doing it too much, and and then October 7th came along, and first of all there was this torrent of bad ideas, and I contradicted and I evolved. Previous to that, by the way, I had blocked maybe half a dozen accounts in my whole time on Twitter, whatever it is, 10 years.
Hmm.
And now I started blocking 30, 50 a day.
Right. Right.
And I couldn't have gone on like that, but I did find, that's why I say block is your friend. I did find after a while, it went down. So that there's something in the way it works that people, there's this pile-on phenomenon that once one person in a certain subculture is posting, then the others will as well. And if that person isn't posting, then the others also don't. So now I'm down to blocking maybe one a day, maybe two.
Mm, that's
And
good.
it's no longer a serious problem. And I feel that I have to stay on because there are things that I know or know how to explain that aren't explained enough. And so I'm staying on. So I'm now posting just about as often as I did when I decided not to post so much.
Oh, okay. Yeah. As like I think you're right, actually, to sometimes I'll argue the case that it's just, I think every intelligent person should detach. But if we do that, then there's a couple theories in mind here. The theory there, like I think about, but the possible outcome would be that just bad ideas don't get checked, and then you just have rampant bad ideas. Whereas a good explanation for you to stay on, or somebody in your position, is that you've now amassed quite a big following, and to just give away that mouthpiece because of being uncomfortable or something like that. You do have to weigh that because we do need rational voices out there. I look at people like, I'll read I still will look at y'all's posts, but I don't engage with anything. But I'll look at yours or somebody like Steven Pinker and just see Richard Landes, who I had on this podcast. I'll look at what he
Oh,
has to say.
interesting. Right.
And And yeah, so I'm glad that those voices are still there. But something I've noticed, like with Steven Pinker, is he's basically taking the comments off. He doesn't want to get the feedback. He just wants to put,
Yeah,
which I completely understand that, because when you're talking some of the ideas that he puts forth, a lot of people actually, I think people think they're square. Anyways, though, yeah, I on that on the October 7th thing, I had, and this was actually you recommended me talk to him, Richard Landes. I read his book, Can the Whole World Be Wrong? I had him on, a very interesting conversation, and he mentioned the theory, uh, your theory, which is the pattern, which is this idea that there's this undercurrent of, it's not anti-Semitism, it's something much deeper than that. It's
yeah,
it's the legitimization of hurting Jews for being Jews, like this idea that
yes,
you legitimize hurting Jews for being Jews. This is what the
yes,
pattern is, and it started long ago, thousands of years ago.
yes.
And I think I asked Richard what his thoughts were on why that came about, and he didn't. I don't know if he had a definitive answer there. What do you have an answer to
I,
that, or?
I, I I have no idea.
Mm,
I can, well, I have some ideas which aren't good enough, let's put it that way. But
right.
the best idea I've heard is from my colleague Mathias Leonardis, who is my colleague in uh, theoretical physics. Um, he thought maybe it's like gold. And when I first heard it's like gold, what's he talking about? Well, the thing is, for thousands of years, gold has been used as money.
Mm.
People use it as a medium of exchange, as a store of value, and so on. And if wherever society is breaking down or there's a disaster or something, people go back to gold. They go back to now. Nobody told them to, and if somebody told them to, they wouldn't obey. They go back to gold only spontaneously. There have been cultures which used silver, and that is like used in a bit of the same way, but gold is the gold standard, of
Mm, right. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
kind of thing,
Oh, that's
right?
interesting. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so so if you ask why gold, why did they use gold? Well, that's on the face of it, it's a bit of a mystery because there are other things like silver or diamonds, which have the same property that they are rare, they are hard to destroy, they are easy to check for authenticity, so on. They are similar to gold in its attributes. So maybe what happened is that once gold had achieved a certain um, takeoff momentum,
Mm,
then people in the situation where they're desperate to have something portable to take their money when they're fleeing from the enemy army or whatever, that they will immediately think of gold because they have heard of people doing this before, and they've never heard of anyone regretting it.
right.
Yeah.
Mm, mm,
So it's possible that the various reasons that have been adduced for why the Jews, is it because they are a scapegoat? Is it because they are a weak minority? They're endless theories. Libraries of books have been written about this, where
right.
everyone
Yeah.
with a different theory. And is it like witchcraft and so on? So, according to Matyaj, that's the wrong way to look at it. It several different groups could have been chosen. They had the right attributes. But the fact that Jews were chosen for some time in antiquity, before the time of Jesus,
Mm,
but not before the time of the Babylonians, so that there were no Jews at that time.
right. Yeah.
So at some point it became a common thing for whatever reason. And from then on, it existed because it existed.
Mm,
So that's why, as I say, almost anything, any idea or movement or set of errors or whatever that gets sufficiently immoral merges with the pattern.
that's
And
so weird. Yeah.
that is itself a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a bit like saying, whenever conditions in a certain place get bad enough, people look to gold.
Right. That's a good analogy. Yeah. Wow. Matyaj landed on something with this analogy.
Yeah, I don't think it fully works, but
Yeah.
as I said, that's the best theory I've heard.
Mm. Yeah, I was raised a Christian. Now I don't believe I mean for obvious reasons, but I think that bad explanations is why I don't believe.
Right.
But you know what's funny is in my culture in my household I was always bewildered or baffled by the idea of people hating Jews, and yet it's so prevalent. It's the strangest thing I mean, it's just, it is very odd. And I think you're right to point out that this is deeper than regular racism because
Yeah.
it has this aspect where you're putting them as the leaders of the world. You're also putting them beneath everybody. You're putting them
Yeah.
as the enemy. I mean, it just encapsulates so much. It's very odd in that way. And so yeah, and whenever you were, I remember you were uh posting a lot about this on October or after October 7th, and I can only imagine some of the abuse that was coming your way for defending
Yeah.
what went on there.
Um, and if it had continued, I definitely would have left X.
Right,
But fortunately, the block worked.
right.
Oh, and Elon Musk changed the block functionality, and I was sure it would stop working. I would that it would stop having this protective effect, but it didn't.
Mm,
So, again, I would have left if it had happened as I thought it would.
yeah, well, I'm glad that it's working out for you in that respect. Yeah. Gosh, well, we've come up on our time here, David. I would go down these rabbit holes. We could do it all day long. But man, thank you so much, David, for responding. I've been trying to, I know you've noticed my email pop through at least once every 6 months. And I was just so happy that we were able to do this today.
Cool.
The Falsifiable podcast probably wouldn't exist without having read your book, both of your books, and going down the rabbit hole of Deutsch. I think in 2013 is whenever I started this journey, and I've not really looked back since, and it's just been trying to find good explanations and doing all this kind of stuff. But
That's very good to hear.
yeah, absolutely, and I know a lot of people feel the same way. So. Again, David Deutsch, thank you for coming on the Falsifiable podcast.
Thank you for having me.